I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that's the plainest way I know to start it. I was 48, sleeping in my father's old room because I hadn't gotten around to fixing the south bedroom roof, waking before dawn to check bee yards that kept getting quieter, then spending afternoons under diesel hoods so I could cover feed, fuel, and the mortgage note the orchard still dragged behind it. Folks around Mill Creek knew me as the Tucker boy who came back after his marriage broke, but I wasn't much of a boy anymore, and I didn't feel like I'd come back so much as folded inward. My father had always said, land could forgive you if you kept showing up. I showed up. I just wasn't sure forgiveness was in the budget that year. The place sat where the foothills started to wrinkle into timber, 12 acres of old apple rows and 3 low fields that used to be pasture, before my dad converted half of one to clover strips for pollinators. In good years, the orchard smelled sweet by mid-April, and the bees worked it so hard you could hear the whole slope hum from the porch steps. That year the blooms came thin and uneven, the kind of weak opening you get after a hard winter and wet March. And then black frost settled in the valley like a bad habit. That was what everybody called it, because late radiational freeze event didn't carry the same dread when you were standing in boots on frozen ground at dawn. Black frost hit low, fast, and mean. It stunned bees on the landing boards before the sun found them and brown blossoms by lunch. You could watch a week of hope turn to paper in one day. By the second week of April, 3 orchards along County Road 12 had for auction signs staked by their gates, bright red against the mud. I drove past them with a knot in my chest and kept my eyes forward, because if I looked too long, I could see my own rows with that same sign at the entrance and somebody else's pickup in my yard. Pride can be a useful fuel, but it burns dirty when you're scared. I kept telling myself I was just behind schedule. Just one weather break away, just waiting on the right run of bloom. Under that talk was the part I didn't say aloud. I'd promised my daughter Ellie we'd keep the family apples in production, and I had made that promise while already seeing brood patterns collapse and mite counts climb. She lived 2 towns over, worked bookkeeping for a farm co-op, and inherited my stubbornness without my bad timing. We hadn't fought exactly. We had drifted into careful, weather-safe conversations where nothing sharp got named. Most mornings started the same. Headlamp on, kettle whistling, Boone's nails clicking over pine floorboards while he waited for me by the back door. Boone was a 12-year-old cattle dog with one cloudy eye and the judgment of a retired foreman. He carried himself like he'd seen enough mistakes from humans and decided to supervise. I'd pull on insulated coveralls, fill 2 thermoses, and walk the nearest yard first, listening before I opened anything. Healthy colonies had a certain steadiness to them, a layered sound like rain on a roof in summer. Weak colonies sounded thin, twitchy, scattered. I knew each box by hand memory. Warped corner on hive 7, smoker burn on 9, cracked lid on the far pallet by the creek. I checked frames for eggs, capped brood, pollen stores, signs of chilled larvae, and every time I found another patchy frame, my stomach dropped the same way. Practical work doesn't spare you feelings, it just gives your hands something to do while your chest tightens. When the morning cold held past sunrise, I lit barrel heaters between vulnerable rows, and fed damp alder to keep smoke low and heat steady. The barrels popped and hissed. Frost traced every twig, and the blossoms looked almost beautiful until you touched one, and it collapsed. By noon, I'd wash up in the shop sink, drive into town, and put 6 or 7 hours into other people's breakdowns. There's comfort in diesel because engines fail for reasons you can usually name. Air in the line, bad injector, clogged filter, worn seals. You diagnose, you replace, you test under load, and the machine either comes back or it doesn't. I liked that honesty. Honeybees were honest too, but weather made liars out of everyone else. A man in a feed cap would lean over my counter and say, "Looks like warming next week." And I'd nod, as if forecasts hadn't burned me all month. One Tuesday, Earl Madden brought his skidder in with a cracked return hose and stood around while I fitted a new line. Earl had worked timber up these ridges since before I was shaving. He watched me torque the clamp and said, "You still running all those hives up Tucker Hill?" I said, "I was trying." He scratched his chin and looked out at the grey lot. Black frost took my daughter's cherries clean. Budded heavy, looked pretty, then gone. Don't take it personal. I gave a short laugh and said, "That advice would have helped me 15 years ago." He grinned once, then got serious. "What ain't your fault? Weather doesn't care about your plans." I wanted to believe him. I also wanted weather to mail me a check for 2 seasons of losses and a decent apology. The worst part of evenings wasn't the work, it was the quiet after it. I'd come home with grease in my fingernails, feed Boone, eat eggs or canned soup standing at the counter, and sit at the kitchen table where my father used to spread county maps and honey invoices in neat stacks. The house held sounds that weren't sounds, just absences with shape. No second coffee mug, no radio from the spare room, no one asking whether I'd remembered to close the upper gate. I started talking out loud while I cleaned tools because silence felt heavier when I pretended to respect it. Once I caught myself saying, "If any of you are taking requests, I could use 10 degrees and 2 calm nights," like I was addressing a committee of ghosts. Boone looked up from his bed, sighed hard, and put his head back down. I told him, "Don't judge me." He blinked in a way that suggested he would continue doing exactly that. Ellie called on Thursdays, almost always between 7 and 7:30, while she drove home from the co-op. We kept the calls practical, maybe because practical things didn't bruise as easy. She'd ask about diesel prices, pallet costs, whether I still had enough drawn comb to split if weather turned. I'd ask if she was eating actual meals and not just vending machine crackers. That April, she asked, "How are set prospects on the Gravensteins?" And I looked out the window at trees that had bloomed half-hearted, then stalled. I said, "If this cold breaks, we'll still make a decent run." The lie wasn't complete. It was more like a withheld percentage. She was quiet for a second, then said, "Dad, I can come up Sunday and help with heaters." I said, "You don't need to burn your day off on my mess." She answered, "It's my mess too." We let that line sit between us. She had my father's direct way of naming what was already true. After that call, I stayed at the table longer than usual, thumb pressed against a knot in the wood my father used to tap when he was thinking. I told myself this couldn't be real in the way it felt real, this narrowing of options, this sense that every decision arrived one day late. I had spent my whole adult life believing effort solved most things. Work harder, learn the machine, keep records, keep your word. But that spring, the framework I trusted started to feel partial, like using a box wrench on a stripped bolt and pretending leverage made up for fit. The crux wasn't money, though money was ugly enough. The crux was shame. I had promised production to a daughter I barely knew how to talk to, and now I was measuring losses in pounds, blossoms, and unsent texts. I started walking the ridge trail at dusk because it was the only hour when my head unclenched. The trail began behind the upper apiary, climbed through cedar and basalt outcrops, then leveled along a shoulder where you could look west over the valley flats. Boone came with me every evening, moving slower than he used to, but still purposeful, ears turning at every thrush note. Up there I could smell thawing soil, wet bark, last year's grass waking. I could hear creek runoff and far-off highway hum, small sounds folded into a wider quiet. I wasn't hunting signs or prayers. I was just trying to wear myself down enough to sleep through the 2 a.m. math that always started in my chest and finished in my jaw. If I walked hard, I slept harder. That was the theory anyway. 3 days into that routine, clouds broke just long enough for a pale stripe of sunset to lay across the foothills. The light turned the orchard rows below into brushed copper and shadow, and even from that distance I could see how uneven the bloom looked, patches of promise next to empty wood. Boone stopped near a basalt shelf where the trail narrowed, lifted his nose, and held still in that intent way dogs have when the world gives them new information. His tail stayed low, but it moved once, slow and steady. I stood there beside him, breathing pine and cold stone, listening to the valley settle for the night, and for the first time in months, I felt a small space open between fear and whatever came next. I kept my hand on Boone's collar for a second, mostly to steady myself, then let him go. He didn't lunge or stiffen the way he did around coyotes. He just took 2 quiet steps forward and looked back at me as if I was the one lagging. The ridge carried that evening smell I'd known since boyhood. Cold cedar needles, damp stone, and the faint mineral bite that rose when day heat finally let go of basalt. Down in the flats, a tractor shifted gears and went quiet. After that, it was mostly wind brushing the tops of firs and the soft tick of Boone's tags when he moved his head. I followed the trail another 100 yards until it widened near an old snag struck by lightning years back. That snag had always looked like a black hand raised out of the slope, fingers split and charred, and my father used to say it marked the point where a person should stop arguing with weather and start adapting to it. I sat on the same flat rock he'd sit on, elbows on my knees, and watched the light flatten across the valley. The orchards below looked orderly from up there, like discipline could still win if you just lined things up right. Up close, I knew better. Patchy bloom, chilled starts, weak flight days, queens laying on half rations. Order was a picture. Loss was the numbers in my notebook. Boone circled once and leaned against my shin with his shoulder, old dog pressure that meant company more than comfort. I scratched the rough fur behind his ear and said, "You ever feel like we're one bad dawn from selling the place to somebody who plants decorative pears and calls it heritage?" He gave me one sideways glance with the good eye, then sneezed. I laughed once, dry and short. Yeah, fair, dramatic wording. The laugh felt rusty, but it landed. Humour had gotten scarce in that house, and when it did show up, it came out half bent, like salvaged wire. The sky dimmed from pewter to deep blue, and the first bats started tracing the edge of the trees below us. I stayed there longer than I meant to, because moving meant returning to choices I didn't want to make yet. Which yard needed syrup first? Which pallets I could combine without losing queens? Whether I should tell Ellie the whole truth now, or wait until I had one concrete win to soften it. A primary consideration was trust, and trust gets thin when someone senses you editing facts in real time. I had been editing facts for months. If this cold breaks was true, we'll be fine was not. I told myself this couldn't keep being my framework, not if I wanted to look my daughter in the eye. I am a practical man, I thought, and practical men don't lie. They postpone panic. Then I heard how weak that sounded even in my own head. I'd built my adult life on diagnosis and repair. Find failure point, replace worn part, test again. Yet sitting there with Boone's warmth against my leg and the valley darkening into a single broad shape, I had to admit there were systems you couldn't muscle back by torque, spec, and persistence. Weather was one. Family was another. Grief sat underneath both, quiet and constant, asking whether I was tired enough to finally stop pretending I could carry every load alone. By the time the last colour drained off the western ridge, the cold began climbing out of the creek bottoms. It moved like water, low first, then upward, laying a thin sharpness over everything. I stood, knees cracking, and started down a side path I hadn't taken in years, a narrow game trail that cut across the basalt face and rejoined the main route lower down. Boone went ahead in his old deliberate trot, nose skimming the ground, pausing now and then where deer had crossed. I kept my flashlight in my pocket. There was enough moon to read the path, and I preferred natural light when I could get it. Electric beams made the woods feel smaller than they were. About halfway down, the forest grew oddly quiet. Not empty exactly, but muted in a way that made me slow. No jays arguing overhead. No squirrel chatter bouncing from branch to branch. Even the usual night insects seemed sparse, their little metal sounds thinned to almost nothing. I stopped and listened harder, trying to separate ordinary lull from something else. Boone had stopped too, one paw lifted, tail low, and moving in short, measured arcs. He wasn't alarmed. He was attentive. There's a difference dogs teach you if you pay attention long enough. We rounded a bend where the basalt pushed outward into a shallow shelf, and I saw the cave mouth first as a darker oval cut into darker stone, maybe 6 feet high, not deep enough for much more than shelter from rain. I knew of it, but had never given it thought. My father called places like that swallow holes, little pockets where cold held late into spring. The ground in front was mostly packed dirt and last year's needles, and in the center of that bare patch sat an arrangement that stopped me in place. 2 flat stones lay crossed in a clean X over a wedge of wild honeycomb the size of my hand. Fresh comb, pale gold, ragged on one side, with a line of honey sliding slow from one cell and catching moonlight like varnish. It didn't look dropped. It looked set. I stood there with my mouth half open, running through every explanation I had. Raccoon drag? No claw marks. Bear feed? No torn logs, no scat, no churned ground. Kid prank? Not up this trail, not with that comb still clean. The stillness around it made the scene feel even more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever placed it had done so, and then stepped back to wait. Boone moved past me before I could decide whether to approach. He lowered his head, sniffed along the cave entrance, then along the comb, then back toward the dark opening. His tail stayed low, but the tip kept wagging. Not excited, not fearful, respectful, if a dog can be respectful. He huffed once, soft, and sat down facing the cave like he was at someone's front porch waiting to be invited in. I stayed where I was and said, "Buddy, if this is where you pick a new friend, I'm going to need some paperwork." The joke came out shakier than I intended. My hands had started sweating inside my gloves. I took one careful step closer, then another, crouched, and held my flashlight low without turning it on. The comb smelled clean and warm, like a hive opened on a good July day. No sourness, no rot, no fermented edge that would suggest disease. I took my hive tool from my belt pouch, clipped off a small fragment from the broken side, and slipped it into a sample vial I carried for field checks. Habit overrode nerves. If there was any chance this came from one of my own struggling hives, I wanted to test it under light back at the shop, look for foul brood signs, spore texture, anything off. When I straightened, I found myself looking toward the cave mouth and waiting, though I couldn't have said what for. My throat felt tight, and I heard my own voice before I decided to speak. "Thank you," I said, quiet and a little embarrassed, aimed at nobody I could see. The words hung there and dissolved into the trees. I gave a small, breathy laugh at myself, the kind you make when you realize you've crossed a line into behavior you used to judge in other people. Then Boone lay down right where he was, front paws extended, chin lifted, as calm as I'd ever seen him around an unknown place. I watched him for a long minute. He did not whine or pace or lean into me for direction. He simply stayed, ears forward, breathing slow as if there was another presence nearby, and he'd already decided it meant no harm. That landed deeper than the crossed stones or the honey itself. Boone had spent 12 years distinguishing trouble from weather from ordinary life, and he was rarely wrong. I stepped beside him, close enough that my boot touched his flank, and the cave gave back only cool air and the earthy smell of wet rock. I did one slow circuit of the clearing with my light still off, then clicked it on low and checked edges for tracks. Near the shelf, where the dirt held moisture, I found impressions too broad and shallow for deer and too symmetrical for any bear print I'd seen, but not clean enough to call anything with confidence. I marked their position in my notebook anyway. Width roughly 7 inches at the broadest point, stride uncertain, direction angled from cedar line to cave and back upslope. I noted wind as light downslope from northwest, temperature dropping quick, moon at 3/4 behind broken cloud. Practical records made me feel steadier, even when the data refused to settle into known categories. After another minute, Boone stood on his own, gave one final sniff toward the dark opening and nudged my knee with his nose. That was his signal to move on. I capped the sample vial, wrapped the remaining comb with a clean cloth from my pocket so I could inspect it later, and set the crossed stones back exactly as I'd found them. I don't know why that mattered, only that it did. As we started down toward home, I looked back once. The cave sat quiet in the moon-washed basalt. No movement, no sound, just that small, deliberate arrangement waiting where I'd found it. I walked the rest of the trail with Boone close at heel, feeling the old weight in my chest and something new braided through it. Not relief yet, not understanding, but a narrow thread of wonder that made room for one more day. I didn't speak again until we reached the yard, and even then it was just a low, "All right, old man, supper first," meant for Boone and maybe a little for me. The porch light threw a weak yellow circle over the mudroom steps, and I stood there longer than necessary with the sample vial in my hand, watching honey move slow against the glass when I tilted it. In the kitchen, I set the wrapped comb on a clean plate, washed up, fed Boone, then carried both pieces out to the shop where I kept my bee gear and microscope on a side bench between injector pullers and torque wrenches. The contrast would have made my father laugh. Diesel manuals stacked next to brood disease charts, socket sets beside queen marking pens. I trimmed a sliver from the fresh comb, set a slide, adjusted focus, and checked cell rims, larval residue, and the thin shine of nectar left in broken wax. No ropey pull, no foul smell, no discolored scale. Nothing that looked diseased. I ran it twice anyway because I wanted the answer to be boring and ordinary, and boring refused to show up. I tagged the vial with date, location, and Ridge Cave sample, then put it in the small cooler I used for specimens that needed steady temperature. After that, I turned the larger piece over under a bright lamp, looking for scrape marks or teeth signatures, some clue it had been mauled out of a wild hive by an animal in a hurry. The edge where it had broken was cleaner than I expected, less torn than lifted, and there was a faint resin smell under the honey, like propolis warmed in sun. I wrote 3 pages of notes and crossed out half of them because they sounded like a man trying to make mystery behave by giving it tidy handwriting. Boone slept by the door, paws twitching in dream, occasionally thumping his tail against the mat like he approved of my overthinking, as long as it happened indoors. When I finally shut off the shop lights, the house still felt empty, but not quite as hostile as it had the night before. By dawn, I was back at the hives, and for the first time in weeks, I caught myself looking uphill toward that trail between checks. Curiosity is a useful engine when grief burns dirty. It doesn't solve the problem, but it keeps the crank turning. I worked yard 1, yard 2, and the pallets near the creek, then climbed after dinner with a fresh notebook, flagging tape, and a pocket scale like I was headed to inspect equipment, instead of a cave I had spent all day pretending not to think about. Boone moved with more purpose than he had all week, stopping at the basalt bend only long enough to sniff, then leading me straight to the shelf. The crossed stones were there. The cloth-wrapped comb I had taken was gone because it was in my truck. In its place sat a forked alder stick laid alongside a sprig of blooming serviceberry, both arranged parallel to the cave mouth, as neat as tools lined on a bench. I crouched and studied the ground without touching anything. The mud held 2 broad impressions near the edge where seep water kept the surface soft. Heels deep, 4 foot wide, no claw marks, stride longer than mine by a full boot length. They weren't sharp casts, more like weighted suggestions, but they repeated in a line from cedar shadow to stone shelf and back. I measured what I could, photographed with my old phone, and set 1 strip of tape on a branch 10 feet out so I could relocate the exact spot in low light. Boone sniffed each print, then looked up the slope and gave a small puff through his nose, relaxed as a dog waiting for his person to finish reading a signpost. I kept expecting my own fear response to arrive on schedule. It never really did. The crux of it was this. Every new detail felt intentional, and none of it felt hostile. 2 nights later, after another hard dawn where frost took the king bloom on the north block, I returned carrying a clean section of capped honeycomb from one of my stronger hives. I had argued with myself all through chores about whether leaving it would be foolish. Feed bears, invite trouble, prove nothing. But the cave wasn't a random clearing, and that first comb had been placed, not dropped. I set my piece on a flat rock just left of the entrance where moonlight reached, then stepped back and said, "That's from Hive 12. Good queen, steady temperament, better than average honey this year, given the circumstances." I realized halfway through that I was giving a product report to a dark hole in a mountain, and nearly laughed at myself again. I also once apologized to a fence post, I added, because if I was going strange, I might as well keep it honest. Boone sat beside me, tail brushing needles, and watched the cave like he was listening to someone breathe. The next morning, I hiked up before first light, cold enough that my mustache had a rim of frost by the time I reached the shelf. The comb was gone. In the exact spot where it had rested were 3 small clusters of early wild flowers, trillium and violet, stems trimmed clean and laid in a triangular pattern, dew beading along the petals. Nobody in this valley arranged wild flowers at dawn on a basalt shelf for jokes. I stood there with my gloves hanging from one hand, feeling my practical mind reach for explanations and come back empty-handed. Boone sniffed the flowers carefully, then lay down with his front paws bracketing the triangle without disturbing a single bloom, as if he understood it had been set there for us to find. I wrote in my notebook, "Gift exchanged. No disturbance, dog calm, human uncertain." It was the most accurate field note I'd made all spring. By the 2nd week of April, my evening routine had a new layer stitched into it. I still burned barrel heaters, still checked brood patterns, still turned wrenches for cash. But every dusk I climbed the ridge and watched for patterns with beekeeper logic, because that was the language I trusted. Wind direction, moisture level, insect movement near feral bee trees. Twice I found forked sticks placed beside trunks, where wild colonies lived high in old cavities. Once I discovered a deadfall branch that had blocked one hive entrance nudged just far enough aside to open airflow from the east, exactly where morning sun hit first. The moved wood carried no saw marks, no torn bark from machinery, just a broad, smooth pressure line where weight had shifted it with control. I checked surrounding soil and found those same wide, shallow impressions leading in and out without churn or damage, like whatever walked there knew how to carry great mass gently. I told Ellie part of it on Thursday night, because part was all I could get past my own throat. I found feral comb up ridge, I said, phone tucked under my ear while I cleaned smoker fuel from my hands. Not diseased, fresh, and there's been odd sign near the cave. She was quiet, engine noise humming through the line. Odd sign like teens messing around, or odd sign like you need me up there this weekend. I looked out at the dark line of trees and chose honesty where I could. Need you up here either way. Frost window looks bad Saturday night. I want extra hands on heaters. She exhaled once. I'll come. And Dad? Yeah. You sound less defeated than last week. Keep whatever is doing that. That landed harder than she knew. We hung up with plans for dawn checks, and for once the call didn't feel like two people balancing glass between them. Friday gave me no answers, only more evidence that the valley itself was tightening for a hard hit. Air stayed brittle all day, and even by noon the low spots held a cold that belonged to dawn. I did final rounds after dark, then set my alarm for 4:10 and slept in coveralls on top of the quilt, because I knew I'd be in and out of the house all night. Boone woke me before the alarm with a low woof and a paw on the mattress. Outside, mist sat low in the orchard rows, thin as smoke, and the stars above it looked painfully sharp. We walked the lower block in the silence, checking bloom condition with a flashlight kept low so I could read petals without shocking the bees that had clustered where little warmth remained. At the edge of the Gravensteins, Boone stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into him. He didn't bark, he didn't bristle. He stood with his weight forward and tail low, wagging once, slow. I cut the light and let my eyes adjust. At first I saw only mist and tree trunks. Then a shape detached itself from cedar shadow downhill, dark against the pale fog, higher at the shoulder than any black bear, and built on an entirely different frame. It moved into the row with an unhurried step, then another, each placement deliberate, as if testing ground not from fear, but from care. Shoulders broad enough to eclipse half a trunk, arms long, forearms thick, hands huge and open. It kept its body angled slightly away from us, giving space in a way no wild animal I knew ever bothered to do. I stood there with my breath held in my teeth and ran through explanations like a man flipping breaker switches in a storm. Escaped bear with mange, wrong gait, wrong posture, wrong hands. Person in gear, no person moved with that weight that quietly threw frozen grass. Exhaustion making shapes out of fog. Boone was seeing it too, and Boone's judgment had fewer bad habits than mine. The figure paused beside a stump at the end of the row and lowered something from its left hand. A broken slab of feral comb, thick and amber, set carefully on the flat top as if placing a bowl on a table. Then it stepped backward, not turning its back on us, just yielding distance. Mist curled around its legs. The cold seemed to gather and soften wherever it passed, like the row itself had agreed to stay still. I wanted to run and I wanted to walk closer, and neither urge won. What held me in place was the same thing that had held Boone quiet at the cave. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. I had spent months bracing against loss so hard, my shoulders never unclenched, and there in the pre-dawn frost, I felt that brace loosen one notch. The figure turned its head toward us then, not abrupt, not challenging, just aware. I caught the line of a brow ridge, the dark fur matted with dew, and eyes that reflected faint amber when starlight hit at an angle. Calm eyes, watchful, not hungry. It lifted one hand slightly, palm turned inward near its chest, then lowered it and backed into cedar shadow until mist swallowed the outline whole. I stayed exactly where I was until the orchard sounds returned in thin layers. The creak of branch against branch, a single robin trying out one note, Boone's steady breathing at my knee. "You saw that," I said, because saying it out loud made the world hold still long enough to stand in. Boone sat and leaned against my leg with his full weight, which was his way of answering questions he considered beneath discussion. We walked to the stump together. The comb was real, cool on the outer wax and warm near the centre, fresh enough to flex when I lifted it with gloved fingers. I set it back down exactly where it had been and marked the spot in my notebook, handwriting uneven for the first time in years. On the way to the house, dawn bled slowly into the east, and every row looked the same as yesterday, except for one non-trivial fact I could no longer file under maybe. I stopped at the mudroom sink with frost still crusted on my cuffs and stared at my hands like they belonged to somebody else. They were steady, which surprised me. My heart was not. I took the sample kit back to the shop, set the lamp low, and checked that slab from the stump the same way I checked every mystery in my life. Weight first, then smell, then structure. It was feral comb, all right, fresh and clean, heavy with nectar, and rimmed with propolis that caught the light in amber streaks. No torn edges from panic feeding, no dirt ground into cells, no sign of scavenger mess. Placed, not dropped. Deliberate. Boone settled by the door, chin on his paws, and watched me work with the calm expression of a dog who had already accepted facts I was still trying to negotiate. I told myself this couldn't be real. Then I put that thought beside the comb and saw which one had more evidence. By full morning, I was out in the lower block, coffee gone cold in the thermos, notebook open on the tailgate. I mapped where I'd seen him, where the stump sat, where wind came through the cedar brake, and where the Gravensteins still held viable bloom. Practical decomposition. That was my old comfort. Break the strange thing into useful pieces, and maybe it stops being strange. But every line I drew led back to the same non-trivial point. Whatever that being was, it had seen me and Boone clearly, chosen not to leave until we saw the comb, and moved away without rush. Not fear, not challenge, space. The resulting tension in my chest had nothing to do with danger. It felt more like standing in a church you don't attend, aware you should lower your voice even if nobody asked. Ellie pulled in just before noon, her little blue pickup rattling over the cattle guard, and stepped out in work boots and my old canvas jacket she'd stolen in high school and never returned. We loaded heater barrels in near silence for a minute before she looked at me hard and said, "You're pale, Dad. Not tired pale. Different pale." I kept coiling hose because eye contact would have made me choose between lying and telling all of it. "I saw something in the lower orchard before dawn," I said. She waited. "Big, not a bear. Moved careful. Left feral comb on a stump and backed away." She didn't laugh, and that alone almost undid me. She set a barrel upright and answered, "You want me to tell you you're overworked?" I shrugged. That was my first theory. She wiped her hands on her jeans. "What's your second?" I looked toward the cedar line. That I've spent years claiming I trust observation, and now observation is asking more of me than I like. We worked through the afternoon with the plain rhythm we'd lost for too long, side by side, passing tools, checking valves, arguing mildly about whether row 6 needed 2 burners or 3. Around 4, she climbed onto the tailgate beside me and opened a sandwich she'd brought from town. "When Mum left," she said quietly, You started talking like every problem had one right wrench size. I think you believed that kept us safe. I nodded because she wasn't wrong. She nudged my shoulder. If this thing is real, and if Boone's calm, maybe the framework just got bigger. I gave a short, crooked laugh. You're 26 and already wiser than I am. No, she said. I just do books for a co-op. I know systems fail in clusters. We sat there watching cloud shadows pass over the rows, and for the first time in years, our silence felt shared instead of guarded. At dusk, I took her up the ridge trail to the basalt shelf, not because I wanted proof for argument, but because secrecy had started to feel like another kind of lie. The crossed stones were still in place. The flower triangle had wilted at the edges but held its shape. Ellie crouched, touched nothing, and looked at the cave mouth a long time. Someone arranged this, she said finally, not a random animal. Boone moved to the entrance, sniffed once, and lay down in that same respectful posture he always took there. We waited while evening cooled around us, cedar smell deepening, thrush notes dropping off one by one. Then from uphill timber we heard soft footfalls measured far apart, weight carried with control. A dark figure stepped between two firs and stopped 20 yards out, broad-shouldered, fur dark with mist, one hand resting on the trunk as lightly as if he didn't want to bruise bark. He looked at us, then at Boone, then lowered his gaze and shifted half a step back to widen the space. Nobody spoke. Ellie's fingers found my sleeve and held on, not from panic, but from awe. The figure stayed where he was, chest rising slow, posture open, no forward lean, no display. In the fading light, I could see those amber-brown eyes catch and release what little sun remained. He bent, set a small forked stick near a patch of violets by his foot, then straightened and took 2 backward steps into shadow, pausing once like he was making sure we understood. This was still an exchange, not a claim. Boone stood, tail low and wagging, and gave a soft huff toward the trees. The figure answered with the slightest dip of his head, then moved uphill and was gone without a branch snap. Ellie let out a breath she'd been holding and whispered, "He wasn't afraid of us." I swallowed hard. "No," I said, "and he didn't need us to be afraid of him either." By the time we got back to the house, the valley forecast had updated on the radio. Low 20s overnight, maybe lower in the creek bottoms. Black frost at Bloom Peak, worst case window. We ate standing at the counter, gloves already on, and checked our plan twice. An hour after dark, we lit the first barrel heaters in the north block, then the Gravensteins, then the younger rows by the fence where blossoms were most vulnerable. Wind moved in thin knives between trunks, and the flames kept trying to gutter. Ellie hauled split alder and I adjusted vents while Boone patrolled slow circuits, stopping now and then to stare toward the cedar break. Around 11:30, the cold deepened enough to sting through wool. She came up beside me, breath fogging. "If we lose set tonight, we can't fake it next month." I nodded. "I know." She touched my arm. "Then we don't lose it." Near midnight, while we were relighting a stubborn barrel at row 4, Boone trotted to the end of the lane and sat, not alarmed, waiting. I looked where he looked and saw movement along the upper edge of the orchard. The same massive figure carrying a slab of comb against his chest with both forearms, walking between trees with a care that seemed almost studied. He stopped at a fork where 2 branches crossed and tucked the comb into the sheltered crotch, pressing it in place with those huge hands until it held firm. Then he moved to the next row, repeating the motion, each placement at points where varieties overlapped and pollen needed to travel. Ellie stood beside me, mouth parted, tears bright from wind and wonder both. "He's mapping the rows," she whispered. He was. He knew the pattern as well as we did, maybe better, choosing the weak-set trees first, skipping the hardier stock, never wasting a step. Then came the part I still struggled to explain without sounding like I've borrowed somebody else's story. At each placement, he brushed his forearms gently along bloom clusters, not hard enough to break petals, just enough to dust one tree, then the next. In his right hand, he carried a soft cedar bough like a wide paintbrush, and used it to bridge blossoms too far apart for his reach, sweeping light, patient arcs that left yellow traces along the needles. Bees that had sat torpid in comb corners began stirring near the warmed slabs, then lifting in short, purposeful flights from one touched cluster to another. Not a frenzy, not a miracle burst, just steady, workable movement where there had been none. The orchard changed tone by increments. First silence, then a thin thread of buzzing, then many small threads knitting into a sound I had missed so fiercely it hurt to hear. He made pass after pass for what felt like hours, though the clock on my phone said 47 minutes. Each time he crossed our line of sight, he angled his body away from us, giving room the same way he had by the cave, and never once crowded Boone, who watched with the solemn attention of a foreman inspecting careful work. Ellie and I did what we could in parallel, rotating barrels, shielding lower limbs with burlap where wind cut worst. But the prevailing truth was plain. We could not have done that much targeted pollination by ourselves in one night, not with 2 people and freezing hands. At one point he paused 6 trees away, looked toward us, then toward the row we had missed by the broken irrigation riser. I nodded before I knew I was doing it. He turned and worked that row first. Collaboration arrived in a form I had never planned for, and my old definitions of help fell apart right there in the frost. First light came thin and blue. The figure made one last placement near the south fence, pressed the comb secure, and stepped back into cedar shadow with no drama, no claim, just departure. Ellie and I walked the rows in stunned quiet, checking blossoms with a hand lens and fingertip. Pollen transfer was visible on vulnerable clusters that had been bare 12 hours earlier. Several king blooms held fresh dusting on stigmas. The Gravensteins showed early set where I had already written loss in my head. After the row checks, we climbed to the basalt shelf, and at the cave mouth we found a small cross of flat stones set beside a clean feather and a thumb-sized smear of propolis on the rock, as neat as a signature. Ellie touched the feather once and looked at me. "We tell anyone?" she asked. I thought about the photos in my phone, the notes in my pocket, the years I had spent measuring worth by what could survive ridicule. "We tell the truth to people who can carry it," I said, "and we keep working." She nodded, then leaned into me hard enough I had to brace my boots in wet grass. I held her with one arm and cried into my glove for a minute I didn't try to hide. Grief, pride, relief, all of it moved through at once, and when it passed there was space where shame had been. Boone pressed against our legs, warm and steady. The sun broke over the ridge in soft gold, touching row after row that now held a fighting chance. And I understood with a clarity that felt both humbling and durable that I had not been abandoned, only asked to recognize kindness even when it arrived outside my familiar paradigm. I stood with Ellie and Boone at the cave mouth while the sun climbed one hand width above the ridge, and the weight I'd been carrying for 2 years finally lost its shape. It wasn't one clean feeling. It came apart in layers. First relief that the trees might hold, then grief for how long I had been bracing for failure, then shame old and stubborn because I had hidden the worst numbers from the one person who had a right to hear them. My knees felt loose, like I'd just stepped off a ladder after a long job, and I sat down on the basalt shelf before they gave out on me. Boone pressed against my shin. Ellie stayed standing, hands in her jacket pockets, waiting me out in that steady way she had when she knew a hard sentence was coming. I stared at the crossed stones and the feather and the little smear of propolis until my eyes blurred again. I need to say this plain, I told her. I wasn't just worried this spring. I was upside down before bloom opened. I combined 5 weak colonies in March and told you I had room to split. I borrowed against the crop note and called it fuel expense. I kept saying we were one weather break away because I didn't know how to tell you I'd already run out of margin. The words scraped on the way out. I thought if I could fix it fast enough, you'd never have to know how close I'd let it get. Ellie lowered herself beside me, slow, like she didn't want to spook a wild thing. "Dad," she said, voice rough from cold and too little sleep. I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad, but I knew. She rubbed her palms together and looked out over the lower rows. "You're not the only one who does the strong and silent routine. I do numbers all day. I can smell panic through a spreadsheet. I kept waiting for you to trust me with the ugly version." She gave a short breath that could have been a laugh if it hadn't been so tired. "You raised me to face hard facts. Then you tried to protect me from hard facts." I nodded and wiped my nose on my sleeve like a teenager, too wrung out to care how I looked. "I was protecting myself too," I said. If I didn't say it out loud, maybe it wasn't true yet. I looked down at my hands, thick-knuckled, cracked from lye soap and cold air. "After your mum left, and after your granddad passed, and after the second bad season, I got real good at pretending effort could cover every gap. Work more, sleep less, keep your mouth shut, call it responsibility. That was the story, but that story was killing me by inches." I drew one long breath that shook on the way in. "I don't want to do that with you anymore." She leaned her shoulder into mine and kept it there. "Then don't," she said. "No speeches, no heroic nonsense. We do what we did last night. We name what's true. We do the next task. We ask for help when we need it, even if help looks strange." She glanced towards the cave, then back to me. "Especially if it looks strange." We sat with that for a while, listening to bees wake in thin patches across the slope, a sound still fragile but real. I had forgotten how loud hope could be when it came back a little at a time. I told myself this couldn't be real for so long that disbelief had become a habit, and habits are hard to set down even when they stop serving you. Sitting there, I felt that habit loosen. I did not suddenly understand the whole world. I did not turn into a man who believed every story he heard at a feed store counter. I was still me, a beekeeper with bad knees and a mechanic's hands, suspicious of easy claims and expensive shortcuts. But I could no longer hide inside absolutes. I had seen deliberate kindness with my own eyes, measured it in comb placements, pollen transfer, and living bloom. I had watched my old dog trust what I was too proud to trust. I had watched my daughter stay when she had every reason to keep distance. Somewhere between the frost and the first bee flight, the part of me that equated vulnerability with failure cracked open, and light got through that crack whether I approved or not. By the time the sun cleared the east firs, we were back in the lower orchard, with clipboards and hand lenses. Moving row by row like auditors of a miracle we still refused to call a miracle. I checked stigmas for fresh dusting, marked viable clusters, flagged the weakest trees for midday reassessment. Ellie counted bloom density and read numbers back to me in that calm co-op cadence that could make any chaos sound sortable. Boone worked 10 yards ahead, stopping where the comb had been tucked overnight, sniffing each placement, then glancing back to make sure we saw what he saw. At row 3, I found myself laughing under my breath for no good reason except that my chest didn't hurt, the same way it had yesterday. At row 5, near the broken riser, I stopped and looked at Ellie. "There's more," I said. "I need you to hear all of it while I still have nerve." She rested her pencil against the clipboard and waited. When you asked set prospects last week, I gave you the optimistic version. When you asked if I had enough drawn comb, I said yes, because I didn't want to look like I was drowning. I made you carry half answers. I'm sorry for that. My throat tightened again, but I kept going. If you want to be mad, be mad. You earned it. She studied me for a long moment, then shook her head once. I am mad, she said. Not at the losses, at the silence. She tapped the clipboard against her leg. But anger's not the only thing I get to choose. I can also choose whether we fix this together. She gestured at the rows. These trees don't care whose pride got bruised. They care whether we show up in the right order. Then her face softened. I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere. I swallowed hard and nodded because speaking would have broken me again. We finished the block in near silence, and it was the good kind, full of work instead of distance. Every so often, one of us would call a number, a variety, a note about wind exposure, practical language, repair language. When we reached the south fence line, Boone stopped with one front paw lifted and looked uphill toward the ridge shoulder above the cave. The fur along his back stayed flat. His tail moved once, slow and level. Ellie followed his line of sight. There, she whispered. He stood at the ridge edge in soft gold light, half in timber shadow and half in morning sun, broad as a gate and still as old stone. No comb in his hands this time. No movement except the rise and fall of his chest. From that distance I could see the long line of his arms, the dark fur roughened by frost melt, and those steady amber-brown eyes that never pinned us, only held us in awareness. He had done what he came to do. The orchard was humming in thin, bright threads below him. There was no performance in his stance, no claim of credit, no invitation to follow. Ellie's fingers found my sleeve again, gentle this time. Should we? She asked, and didn't finish. She meant photograph, wave, call out, all the human things we do when we're afraid a true moment won't count unless we capture it. I took my phone from my pocket, looked at the blank screen, then put it back. No, I said quietly. We witness. That's enough. She nodded, and Boone sat down beside us like he approved the decision. For several breaths, none of us moved. Wind slid through the upper cedars, carrying resin and thawing earth. A pair of jays landed 2 trees over from him, noisy as always, then settled instead of scattering. That detail hit me harder than scale did. The woods behaved around him the way they behave around weather that belongs. He lifted one hand slowly, not high, just to chest level, palm turned inward for a heartbeat, the same small gesture I had seen in frost-dark rows before dawn. I answered with a nod, because it felt truer than any wave I could have forced. Then he turned, unhurried, and walked into the timber without looking back again. Each step was placed with that same deliberate care, even on his way out, as if leaving mattered as much as arriving. No branch crash, no dramatics, no final reveal. Dark fur slipped between trunks, then became shadow, then became nothing I could point at. The ridge held his absence for a moment like an echo, and then it was only forest and light and the ordinary sounds of morning opening wider. We stayed there until the cold lifted off the grass. Ellie wiped her cheeks and gave a breathy laugh that trembled at the end. I'm going to spend the rest of my life sounding like a liar, she said. Welcome to the club, I answered, and that got a real laugh out of both of us. Boone stood, shook once from nose to tail, and trotted toward row 2 because in his mind the ceremony was over and we were late to tasks. On the walk back, we stopped at the cave one more time. The stones were still crossed. The feather still lay clean against basalt. I took a small square of wax paper from my pocket, lifted a pea-sized bit of the propolis thumbprint with my hive tool, and wrapped it carefully for the sample box. I said out loud so there was no confusion later. Physical sample, cave shelf, dawn after frost event, collected by Clint Tucker, witnessed by Ellie Tucker. She repeated the note and snapped one photo of the rock face with the stones in place. Then one of my gloved hand holding the wrapped sample. "For records," she said. "For records," I agreed. At the truck, I set the sample in the cooler beside the earlier comb fragment and closed the lid. Then I called Earl Madden from the porch rail, because he was the only neighbour I trusted to hear one narrow piece without turning it into town entertainment. He picked up on the third ring. "Earl, it's Clint. Frost hit hard, but we held more set than expected. I may bring you pollen notes later if your daughter wants comparisons on her cherries." He grunted, then said, "You sound different." I looked out at the rows at Ellie already relighting a heater for one last pass through the low spot. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." He was quiet for a beat. "Good," he said. "Bring the notes." When I hung up, the house behind me felt like a place people could live in again, not just endure. I walked down to Ellie, took the other side of the barrel, and together we rolled it toward the next row while Boone ranged ahead through sunlit grass, and the ridge above us kept its counsel in perfect, ordinary silence. By noon we had the last heater barrels tipped out and cooling by the fence, and Ellie followed me into the shop with 2 clipboards, my field notebook, and the cooler from the truck tucked against her hip like it held eggs. I cleared a space on the steel bench between a fuel pump housing and my microscope, then set each piece out in order so nothing got lost in the noise of relief. The first cave comb fragment in its labelled vial, the slab sample from the stump wrapped in wax paper, the pea-sized propolis lift from the thumbprint, and a printout of the 2 cave photos she had taken that morning. Boone sprawled by the open door where sun warmed the concrete, one ear tipped toward us. "Say it again exactly," Ellie said, pencil ready. I read from my notes. "Ridge cave sample, collected night 1. Stump comb pre-dawn lower Gravensteins. Propolis sample, cave shelf after frost event. All handled with clean tools, sealed same day." She wrote fast, then looked up. "And the flowers?" 3 clusters, trillium and violet, triangular arrangement. No ground disturbance. The forked sticks? 3 sightings by feral bee trees, 1 by cave, 1 placed during visual contact. She tapped the pencil against her teeth. The move deadfall? Shifted just enough for airflow and morning sun on a wild hive entrance. I nodded toward the notebook. And broad mud prints, repeated, shallow, no claw marks. We measured and photographed what we could. She set the pencil down and gave me that direct look I used to dodge. "Do you want these records because you need to prove it, or because you need to honor it?" The question sat there. "Both," I said, "but mostly the second one." By the next Tuesday, I drove the sealed samples to the county extension office and asked the clerk to log them for disease screen and pollen composition. I did not give her the whole story. I said I was tracking an unusual feral contribution during a frost window and needed objective data. She labelled each bag with barcodes and pushed the form back for signatures. Under source location, I wrote Tucker Foothill property and left out the cave. Evidence suggests discretion is sometimes part of stewardship, and that was the framework I chose. 3 days passed before dispatch from the state apiarist's lab called me back. I was under a tractor replacing a hydraulic line when my phone buzzed in my chest pocket. I slid out, wiped my hands, and answered. A man introduced himself as Dr. Harlan from the lab. "Mr. Tucker, your samples came through clean. No foul brood indicators. No chalk brood concerns in what you sent. The comb appears healthy feral Apis mellifera. Propolis sample is interesting. Heavy apple pollen, some willow, early serviceberry, and cedar particulates." "Cedar?" I asked. Cedar dust or resin trace, yes, not harmful. Might indicate handling near conifers. I looked toward the ridge from the shop door. That tracks. He went on, practical and even. As for your pollination spike during freeze, we'd usually attribute that to microclimate pockets, smoke management, and timing. You probably did better mitigation than you think. I thanked him, wrote down the report number, and asked for email copies. He sent them within the hour. I printed 2 sets, one for the farm binder and one for Ellie, and filed the originals in a manila folder marked Spring Frost Event. That evening, I put the physical samples back in the cooler, then moved them to a locking cabinet in the shop where I kept Queen records and land deeds. Not hidden, stored. On Friday, I kept my word to Earl and drove pollen notes over to his daughter's cherry block. Earl met me by the pump house with his cap pushed back and his usual half squint. We stood over my chart on the hood of his truck while his daughter compared bloom timing against my row map. Earl listened quiet, then said, "You got set where you shouldn't have." "We did," I answered. He gave me a long look, the same one from his skidder day, only softer now. My granddad used to talk about a ridge keeper. Said sometimes after bad cold he'd find crossed stones near old bee trees and branches moved like a careful hand had been there. Most folks called it campfire talk. He scratched his jaw and shrugged. I never saw the one he saw, but I saw those stones once when I was 19 and kept my mouth shut 40 years. I didn't ask him for more. He had just revealed what he had carried, and that was enough. "I appreciate you telling me," I said. He nodded toward Boone, who was nosing clover at the ditch edge. "Dog knew first, didn't he?" "Yeah," I said. He did. By the first week of May, Ellie and I sat at my kitchen table with the co-op ledger open, and for the first time since my divorce, there were no edited columns between us. She wore reading glasses low on her nose and drew boxes around numbers with a red pen, like she was fencing off bad habits. I handed her every debt sheet, every feed invoice, every repair slip I had softened with vague labels, and she recalibrated the books line by line. She didn't spare me. "No more miscellaneous fuel, Dad. If it's borrowed against crop, call it borrowed against crop." "Fair," I said. No more weather-optimistic projections for my feelings. I almost smiled. That one might take repetition. She looked up. Then we repeat it. We built a recovery plan right there over chipped mugs and Boone's snoring. 2 modest splits after flow. Replace old queens in the weakest yards. Delay non-critical equipment purchases. Keep emergency reserve for another frost year. The trade-offs were not glamorous, but they were honest. That night, before she drove home, she stopped in the mudroom and said, "I trust you more now than when you were pretending to be fine." Then she hugged me hard and left me standing with my hand on the doorframe, grateful and a little stunned. In June, set held. Not perfect, not storybook, but solid enough that I walked rows at dawn and stopped bracing for catastrophe every 3rd step. Bees worked the lanes in steady sheets of sound, and the Gravensteins carried fruit where I had penciled in loss. We still found some frost-scored clusters, but the vulnerable varieties had enough viable hold to keep contracts alive. At the co-op meeting, Ellie presented projected yields without apology in her voice. Afterward, outside by the loading dock, she bumped my shoulder and said, "Family orchard stays in family hands." I had no clever reply, just a nod and wet eyes I didn't bother hiding. I never posted the photos. I never sent them to forums or late-night radio shows or men who collect mysteries like trophies. The report folder stayed in the cabinet, and the digital copies went on a flash drive in my desk drawer. The flagging tape I had tied near the cave came down on a clear morning in July. I walked up with Boone, removed it, and packed out every scrap I had left there because marking a place is useful for study and disrespectful if you leave it forever. The crossed stones were not there that day. Neither was the feather. The shelf held only lichen, basalt, and a quiet that felt complete rather than empty. I noted in my book, markers absent. No sign of disturbance, no further setup observed. When September harvest came, Ellie ran bins while I worked the lift, and we moved fruit until our shoulders burned and our boots stuck sweet on press room floors. We argued about pallet order, laughed about my handwriting, and shared sandwiches on overturned crates. One afternoon, she handed me a clean label she'd printed for the honey line and said, "Read that." It said Tucker Ridge Orchard Honey in block letters, and underneath, small and plain, "Produced with care." I looked at her. "That all?" "That's all," she said, "true and sufficient." By the second week of October, I had started carrying one dried comb fragment in my truck's glove box, wrapped in wax paper inside a tobacco tin so it wouldn't crumble. Not as a relic to show people, as a reminder to myself on hard mornings when old habits came back. When I caught my mind saying there are only two outcomes, win or lose, I'd touch that tin and remember the night a third outcome walked out of cedar shadow and worked beside us without asking for credit. The following spring, on the first warm evening after willow bloom, I hiked to the cave with Boone and a clean section of capped honeycomb from Hive 12, same as before. I set it on the flat rock left of the entrance, then placed two small stones in a cross beside it, not copying so much as answering. I stood there with my hat in my hands and said, "Thank you. Orchard held. We're still here." Boone sniffed the cave mouth, tail low and wagging, then sat at my knee, like we were keeping an appointment. No figure stepped out, no branches moved. Dusk settled through cedar tops and jays argued in the draw, like they owned it. I waited a respectful minute, then turned for home with Boone trotting close, carrying that same grounded certainty I'd been given. The world does not shrink to what I can explain, and kindness does not lose its reality because it arrived in a form I never expected.